Let's talk about the Magi and how they knew that the Messiah had been born. Now, of course, they referred to him as the King of the Jews, and we're going to find out why in just a little bit. But let's talk about the Magi. The origin of the Magi is actually from the Medes. The Medes were an Iranian people who lived in the area known as Media. Media was where modern-day Iran is today. Now, the Medes were made up of 6 tribes: the Busei, the Pertusini, the Strucatis, the Arizanti, the Budai, and the Magi. And the Magi were the priests. They were the religious leaders for all of the other Median tribes, just as the tribe of Levi was the tribe of priests for all of the tribes of Israel. Now, let me explain what the word Magi means. Our English word Magi comes from the Greek word Magos. And the Greek word Magos is a transliteration of the ancient Persian word Magus, which meant wise. So the Magi were considered to be very wise. And because of the wisdom, they served inside the royal palace as part of the king's advisors. First in the Babylonian Empire, and then in the Medo-Persian Empire, and finally in the Parthian Empire, which was the empire at the time of Jesus Christ's birth. So the Magi that went to Jerusalem at the time of Jesus Christ's birth were from the Parthian Empire. Now, the Magi were considered to be experts in 2 fields: astronomy and oniromancy. How many of you know what oniromancy is? How many of you know what it is? Well, it's dream interpretation. So astronomy and interpreting dreams were their 2 areas of expertise. And that's very important. I'm going to show you why in just a little bit. But first, let's talk about the impact that Daniel had on the Magi. Because the Magi would have never traveled to Jerusalem had it not been for Daniel. So as I'm giving you a brief history of the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Parthian Empire, I'm also going to weave stories of Daniel into it, along with how he impacted the Magi. And I'm going to do that so you can see how Daniel changed everything. I'll be honest with you. You cannot understand the book of Daniel until you understand Middle Eastern history and the role that Daniel played in that history. In fact, it impacts the entire Bible. So let's start with the Babylonian Empire. In 626 BC, Babylon rebelled against the Assyrian Empire, who was the world power at that time. And in 612 BC, they overthrew the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. But they didn't become a world power until they conquered Egypt in 605. Now, right after they conquered Egypt, they turned on Israel, and in 605 BC, they took their very first captives from Judah. And Daniel was among them. In fact, Daniel was just a teenager when he was taken into captivity. Most scholars believe that he was about 14 years old. Now, this first group of captives were the upper class. You see, there were actually 3 groups of captives that were taken into captivity at different times. This was the very first group. They were the most educated and the wealthiest, and they were taken for 2 reasons. Number 1, to deplete Judah of their smartest and their brightest citizens, which would weaken them. Think about this. If you took the brightest, the most intelligent people from America, and you took them to another country, what would it do to America? Well, it would weaken us. The second reason they took them as the first set of captives is because they wanted to strengthen Babylon by bringing the most talented and the most intelligent men from the other nations. So in doing this, they would weaken the other nations and they would strengthen their own nation. So Daniel was taken to Babylon as a teenager, but he was allowed to continue his education so that he could eventually put it to good use in helping the Babylonians. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Daniel chapter 1, verses 17 through 21. It says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. He's going to fit right in with the Magi, as we see. Now, at the end of days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You guys know who those are, right? Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They changed their names to Babylonian names. Therefore they served before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued unto the first year of King Cyrus. Now, Shortly after Daniel began working in the royal palace, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. If you want to get technical, it was a nightmare. And he woke up in a cold sweat. And he called all the Magi and he wanted them to interpret the dream. Because that's what they did. That was their area of expertise, to interpret dreams. The only problem was, he didn't just want them to interpret his dream. He also wanted them to tell him what he had dreamed. And it wasn't because he forgot the dream. The reason he wanted them to do that is because he was afraid that they would just make up the interpretation. On the other hand, if they could tell him what he had dreamed and then interpret the dream, then he would know that the interpretation was true. And of course, they couldn't do it. So he ordered all of the wise men in his empire to be executed. Not just the Magi, but all of his advisors. Because at that point, he thought that, well, you're all frauds. You're supposedly these wise men. You supposedly have all these powers. If you can't tell me that, then you're frauds. So he decided to execute all of his advisors. Look at verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2. The king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among people. The king was furious when he heard this, and he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon be executed. Now, most of you know the story. When they came to execute Daniel, Daniel told the executioners to wait, to give him a little bit of time, and God would tell him what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed, and he would also give him the interpretation of the dream, and that's exactly what God did. So Daniel went to Nebuchadnezzar, and he told him what the dream was and the interpretation, and Daniel was promoted above everyone else. Look with me, if you would, in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse number 48. Then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. Now, this is referring to the administrators. So Daniel became the top dog over all of the administrators. But eventually, Daniel was promoted over everyone, including the Magi. Look at Daniel chapter 5, verse number 11. There is a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insight, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers of Babylon. Now, the word chief is translated from the Aramaic word rab, which means supreme leader. So Daniel became the supreme leader of the Magi. And when that happened, he brought other Jews into this group, men like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and all of those Jews who were faithful to Yahweh. And he also replaced the religious practices of the Magi with the Jewish religion, according to rabbinic tradition. Now, during the time that he was the supreme leader of the Magi, Daniel had several visions. These are the visions that you love to read about and the visions that we looked at when we were going through the book of Revelation. He had the vision of the 4 wild beasts. He had the vision of the ram and the he-goat, and he also had the vision of the 70 weeks. And then Daniel was given the interpretation of these visions. These visions predicted what was going to happen in the future. First, the Babylonian Empire would fall and the Medo-Persian Empire would take its place. And of course, that's exactly what happened, just the way that Daniel said that it would. Secondly, a Greek ruler would invade and conquer the Medo-Persian Empire. But a short time later, he would die. In fact, it predicted that he would be very young, and at the prime of his life, he would die. And what age was he when he died? 33 years old. 33 years old, and he conquered the majority of the known world. And his kingdom, Daniel said, would be divided among his 4 generals. And that's exactly what happened. Alexander the Great invaded and conquered the Medo-Persian Empire. And after his death, the Grecian Empire was divided among his 4 generals. And then a 4th empire would arise, Daniel predicted, greater than any empire before it, which of course was the Roman Empire. So Daniel was spot on. Now, Daniel received all of these prophetic visions while he was the supreme leader of the Magi in Babylon. But he was still alive when the Babylonian Empire fell and the Medo-Persian Empire came into power. In fact, he was elevated to the supreme leader of that empire with no one above him except the king. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Daniel chapter 5. We're going to read verse number 30, and then we're going to jump to chapter 6 and read verse number 3. Notice what it says. Or actually, we're going to read all the way to verse number 3 in chapter 6. That very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and to protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. So in the beginning, what he did was he divided his entire empire into 120 different provinces. And then he put 3 men over all of these. But Daniel proved himself to be so wise, so smart, so loyal, that he actually decided to make him over the entire empire, and the only one that was above him was the king himself. Now, as you can imagine, this didn't go over very well with the other administrators and the high officers. And not just because of envy, but because Daniel was a Jew. And they were anti-Semitic, just like most people are today. I'll be honest with you, our world is very anti-Semitic, and there's a spiritual cause. There's a spiritual cause behind this. And that spiritual cause is that God chose this people to bring forth the Messiah. And because God has chosen the Israelites, the devil hates them. And you can see that in the world today. In fact, the administration that we have today is not very friendly towards Israel. And let me tell you, that will bring God's judgment down upon America. We must always be on Israel's side. I just want you to understand that. Getting off track, but I want you to understand. When Daniel was promoted to be the top dog, no one above him except the king, it caused the other administrators, all the other high officers, to be very envious, but they were also upset because he was a Jew. So they devised this plot to get rid of him. They approached the king and they asked him to pass a law that for 30 days, any person who prayed to anyone besides the king would be thrown into a lion's den. Look at Daniel chapter 6, verse number 7. And let me just say this. Daniel was an old man by this time. Remember, the Babylonian Empire has fallen. Now it's the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel is in his 80s. He's not a young man, as the pictures show. Look what it says in verse 7. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. Now, we all know the story. Daniel is faithful. It doesn't matter what the law says, there's a higher spiritual law. So he continues to pray to God, and he's discovered. So what took place is he was thrown into the lion's den, but God shut the lion's mouth, and Daniel was unharmed. But in retaliation, the king had all of the men that urged him to pass this law thrown into the lion's den. And they all died along with their families. But the men who died were the leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire. And many of them were Magi. So who filled their positions? Well, you got it. Daniel filled those positions with Jews. So the Magi were slowly being infiltrated by more and more Jews. In fact, they were the majority of the Magi. Now, remember, Daniel had changed their religious practices during the Babylonian Empire. They had begun to worship as the Jews worshipped. And now that change is being reinforced and is going to continue through the Medo-Persian Empire, because the Jews are the ones that are in the leadership positions. They are the ones who are now the leaders. Is everyone with me? Now, shortly after that, Daniel passed away. And about 200 years later, the Medo-Persian Empire fell to Alexander the Great, just as Daniel had prophesied. And when Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. Let me show you how his kingdom was divided. Let's put that slide up. He had 4 generals. He had Cassandra, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. In fact, let me just go off on a tangent. Do you mind if I do that? How many of you have ever heard of the 400 silent years? Supposedly from the time of Malachi, which is the last book in the Bible, or Old Testament, not Bible, Old Testament, all the way into Matthew, there's a period of 400 years, and that's called the 400 silent years. Anyone heard of that? Those are not silent years. Daniel prophesied about them in the last book of Daniel. In fact, you get a detailed account of everything that's going to happen in those 400 years, and it happened just the way that Daniel said it would. That's why a lot of liberals deny that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel, because there's no way it could happen. And yet, when you find out that Daniel was in the Septuagint, you realize, oh yes, this was translated so many years before these liberals say that it was. And so Daniel actually predicted everything that was going to come to pass. But anyways, I'm getting off track. I have the tendency to do that. These are the 4 generals. Cassandra took over what is now Greece and coming up into Macedonia. Lysimachus actually took Turkey. That's what's modern day Turkey. Seleucus had the largest. He actually came in and took most of the Persian Empire, or the Medo-Persian Empire, in here. And then Ptolemy took Egypt, going all the way down into Sudan, Ethiopia, and those countries. But those were the 4 generals at that time. So you actually had 4 mini kingdoms. And this is where the Parthian Empire comes into play.